recording this over here. There we go. Okay, I think we're live. Sorry, we're a couple minutes late. We were planning in the background. So it's my pleasure. This is another edition of the Perception Action Journal Club. The idea here is we just got together to talk about a particular topic. If you're watching us on wherever you're watching us, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, I think, Twitter or X, whatever it is, you can comment, and they'll comment, or if you have a question, they'll come to us, and I can pose them to the group, and we can maybe answer. We'll see. So today I'm joined by Randy Sullivan, a regular on the podcast from the Florida Baseball Armory. Hey, Randy, thanks for joining us.
Hi. Yeah.
And then Alan Jaeger, I got a new guest. You're Jaeger Sports, Alan. Is that your kind of main? Awesome, perfect. So today we're here to talk about, well, we could have this podcast every year, right? Pitcher arm injuries, right? It's when I came up with that, I started to think about this topic. I think it was 1 week, Spencer Strider a lot. We lost like 4 or 5 pitchers, went down with elbow problems. We just had this week again, Garrett Whitlock a couple of days ago. It's never ending, right? So this is a never ending problem. And so what we want to do is just kind of brainstorm and talk about some of the exercises we do to how we can deal with this, right? How we can prevent arm injuries. And I think I'll post a start. I think I hear a lot of people ask, what is it? Is it the clock, the pitch clock? Is it the pitchers are throwing higher velocity? Is it they're asked to throw curveballs or sliders? Is it the number of pitches? It's whatever. To me, the answer to that question is yes, right? It's all of those things, right? Where a pitcher is a complex adaptive system, how they're going to react to changes like that, those are all constraints, and you cannot predict. They're going to be a completely unpredictable outcome. So trying to identify the cause of arm injuries in pitching is a lost cause in my opinion, right? For the longest time, we were chasing the number of pitches and things like that, and we seem to have reduced that, and still we get injuries. So that was. So let's go. Maybe I'll start off. Randy, what do you have open? You must get asked this question all the time, right? With what you do,
especially this time of year. Like every single year, somebody goes down this time of year. And I was looking back in some things that I'd written back in 2014. We had a big flurry of injuries in 2014, and the sky was falling, and what's the cause of all these injuries? And I don't know that we're seeing, of course it's been climbing, but we're not seeing some radical sort of hockey stick thing. I think when really well-known people get hurt, it kind of raises everybody's ire a little bit, or everybody's interest a little bit. But it often happens at the beginning of the season. We see this a lot, rise in injuries. That's pretty well documented. Which kind of makes us begin to question like the path that we've been headed down. Okay. I was reading, I learned this term in Alex's new book, Transforming Basketball, right? Path dependence, like how we are just stuck in this path of one research paper leading to another one on the same topic, on the same topic, on the same topic. And in the medical world, and I'm not disparaging anybody. I'm a member of, hopefully, an esteemed member of the medical community. I don't want to disparage anyone, but we've been down this path of workload and volume, right? Everything has been, okay, this many pitches, and then it became quantifying workload. Let's use motion capture and wearables to kind of quantify what output, what workload is, and how much an elbow can tolerate. And we've gone down this path dependence. I was reading something the other day that it's analogous to, we have train tracks that are the same width apart in every place in the world right now. And the reason they're that width apart is because that was horse-drawn carriages. That was what we used for trolleys, and it was too expensive to build actually more efficient railroad tracks. And so we have the same skinny railroad tracks we've had. And we just keep going down that path, and we keep going in the injury quest down the same pathway of workload and reducing stress, like minimizing the amount of stress that the tissue is exposed to. And Alan and I are both in agreement with this, that I think maybe we at least have to be willing to look laterally and say, What if we're going down the wrong path? And maybe there's a different place to go. And so instead of doubling down on workload and stress and trying to limit the amount of stress or mechanically limit the amount of exposure to stress, maybe we just accept that the stress is inevitable. I've been writing this new book about, and I'm talking about the internal dynamics. And I've come to the conclusion that once we get to the shoulder and then to the elbow, early in the movement, there are a lot of possibilities for variability because it's lower intensity. But then as it transfers from the pelvis to the torso, then to the shoulder, the options for movement solutions become less available. There's less options available. And now we need to be more precise. And I'm beginning to believe that maybe we cannot mechanically mitigate that stress. Maybe it's just going to happen at the end of the movement, at layback and at ball release, the elbow's exposed. And I don't think we can do much mechanically to stop it. I think that what we can do is condition the body to be able to tolerate it. And that's where Alan long toss and things like that we can talk about in a bit come in. It's about let's not so much, every time we limit volume and limit stress, we seem to have an increase in injuries. So maybe we just go, hey, maybe we better, we need to learn to sprain our ankles better. Like we're gonna sprain it. We need to learn to sprain it better and not have it be so catastrophic. That's one area. And then as I studied more and more, and I came across your information on the variability, the overuse, variable overuse hypothesis on injury. How, and Alan and I talk about this a lot, the definition of overuse, which is allegedly the culprit in all these injuries, is overuse. The definition of overuse is doing it exactly the same way over and over and over again. So by allowing a little bit more bandwidth of movement variability, we can distribute the stresses differently on every throw and thereby be able to tolerate the inevitable stress that's going to happen at the end point because we get there a different way every time. And I think that's the whole theme of this Journal Club podcast is just how do we look into variability as a possible way to mitigate this injury problem. So
yeah, I like to think it like that's the third axis: workload, frequency, variability. It's kind of that we're ignoring. Alan, do you have any kind of, how do you think about this when people ask you this question? You must also get a lot too, I bet.
Well, I mean, number one, I would punt to Randy to all of the anatomical, mechanical, biomechanical stuff, and also his feel, and he and I are so in alignment. And so I'll just try to throw in a few maybe extra little pieces. One is risk aversion versus nature. I'm a huge fan of nature. I think so is Randy. I feel like we just have to get back to listening to the body and trusting the higher intelligence of the body. And I feel like, as we all know, there's been, pitch counts came in like the 90s, and 120-foot throwing program came in around the 90s. And now we have workload management. And I'm not saying there's not a time and a place for this, but what's happened is we've put the cart before the horse, right? And we need to get back to, as Randy said, we have to get back to trusting that part of getting, as Randy uses the word robust all the time, is that you have to incrementally, right, manage the delta, as Marcus Elliott says. You have to manage the delta, but I think we have to look more into the conditioning side, and that to me is the nature side, because we naturally want to go out. Look, if you're going to run a marathon, you don't run a mile a week and all of a sudden show up 6 months later and go for it. Right? You gradually work yourself into shape. And so I think a couple of things. One is, I think we have to start really getting back to the basics of trusting the conditioning and volume and building tolerance, as Randy would say. And two, just on a completely side note, is I feel like the off season, which is just one other topic I'll hit and then we can move on. And again, Randy and I talk about this as well. There's just too much high intent throwing all the time, right? All the measurables now, whether it's Rapsodo, because of these measurables, right? Kids roll out of bed and then go to a local academy and they have access to, if I threw 90 today, I want to throw 91 tomorrow, right? So there's maybe not as much a concept of this gradual workload or this conditioning volume-based throwing prior to high intent throwing. And now, and again, I don't have a lot of data for this. This is just my gut from doing this a long time. But I think now a lot of times, like, let's use just the pro model because it's a little easier. From October 1st to March 1st or whatever it is, yeah, sure, they rest and deload and do whatever they need to do. But, they're probably spending a lot of their off-season time trying to get more spin rate on their curveball or whatever, or they're trying to get more vertical break on their fastball. And so my gut tells me there's just a lot of higher intent throwing. Also, they go to a lot of facilities. You've got cold weather states to where they maybe can't get outdoors for many months. And they're not maybe doing a really good long toss program that's been progressively built up. And so I think just those are a few of the things that jump out at me. Too much high intent work, and then too much shocking of the arm. Yeah, you just can't shock the arm. The arm needs to always be conditioned well prior to high intent throwing, and I just feel like we have to get back to that.
Yeah, no, I think those are really good points. Yeah, it's no coincidence that this issues always comes at the start of the season. At the same point in the season, and we don't talk about this. It seems the guys are starting to come back, and maybe it's too late to ask this question, right? That's the problem. We need to be conditioning. Yeah. No, I think, and I agree with you, Randy. The path dependency, kind of doing the same old kind of aversion to number of pitches, number of, and I think, Alan, I like your point about like the kind of having the goal of practice clear. Like you're right. If you went out to train for a marathon by working on making your mile time shorter every run, right? That would be a horrible way, right? You wear yourself, but that seems to be what we're doing, right? We're going out and sprinting harder than we did last time. And that we need some practice. Let's run long and slow and mix up the goals of practice, right? So let's get into, so Randy, you kind of, when you talk about conditioning the arm, so we talked about a couple things. One, progressions, right? Building the strength in different, in progressions, are you talking about using different constraints? Alan, you mentioned in long talk, like distance, kind of building up the distance. What other how do you kind of use that as a tool to kind of condition?
Yeah, I think one thing we have to understand is that, Davis's law in physiology says that all human tissue adapts to align to the stresses upon which it's placed. Okay, so this is actually not a bad time to bring this question up because college seasons are ending, high school seasons are ending, and a lot of people are tempted to take a month off or a couple of months off before they start, and their arm gets deconditioned and the tissue organizes because there's no stress, somewhat like a plate of spaghetti noodles that you left in the sink all night. It's just random and chaotic. There's no guiding of the self-organization of the physiology. I think that we need to keep the tissue organized and not let it get chaotic. Try to guide it as it recovers. I get that people need a couple weeks off to kind of decompress psychologically, go to the beach, hang out, be a person, right? But throw something during that time. Throw something. Keep the arm moving. I think this prolonged shutdown is really problematic because now the season, we get to ramp it up and now we're trying to reorganize the scar tissue, right? And that's the physiologic change, right? And then we go to the neurology, the self-organization. So whenever we have these prolonged shutdowns, a lot of times guys will go in the gym and they'll lift weights and they'll get bigger muscles. And that's akin to when you were 12 years old and you grew 6 inches in a month and you didn't know where anybody apart. The proprioception is different. The self-organization is different. That's an organismic constraint that you've added that has changed. And you need to learn to manage that from the coordination dynamics. And so I never want our pitchers to be disorganized physiologically or neurologically. I want to keep that bundle tight. So in our world, we're throwing not necessarily at a high intent every time, but we're throwing to keep the tissue organized so that in our world, we're never more than about 3 or 4 weeks away from being ready for competition. You don't have to be competition ready all the time, but you need to be raise the threshold so that you're not just completely fighting your way back. It's like that roller coaster weight loss thing that people do, just be close to being ready all the time. And so I think the way we handle that is with variability is, see, people mistake this, that workload has to mean intensity, or that overload means intensity, right? If we begin to look at overload, because to get an adaptation, we need to overload the tissue, right? Progressive overload. But if we look at overload as not just in the weight room, weight, or in throwing harder, but use variability as the load instead of weight or intensity, now we can add new stimuli that give us different self-organization pathways to get to the same endpoint. And now we can get a more robust tissue, so that when we're in season, we've developed lots of different movement solutions for the same problem. As you know, the body isn't interested in one solution to solve the problem. That is not robust. If we fail, we lose. We need to have a family of reasonable solutions. And so things like long toss, I love long toss. In 2011, this study came out about long toss, and they used motion capture and determined that it was problematic because it increased the stress on the elbow and it changed the pitcher's mechanics. And as I talked to Alan for the first time, I said, Alan, they thought that study would be the end of long toss. What they did, they didn't realize those are the two reasons we like long toss.
Yeah, because that's the whole point of it.
Yeah. It's not refuting the value. It is actually confirming it, that every throw is a little different, and we get to add stress in a different way progressively and bring it. And so if you think about long toss, every throw is just a little bit different, right? And it takes us away from our normal mechanics, gets us throwing on a little bit of arcs. We change the self-organization dynamics, and we add stress progressively so that we don't get the tissue beyond its yield capacity. We teach it, we toughen it up as we go along. So I think those things we use a lot of, and also in our approach, pitching is sort of a closed skill, right? And so it needs to be treated like an open skill. You need to give a lot of variability. You need to have them throwing while they're on the run, jumping left, jumping right, jumping off boxes. And it doesn't have to be crazy now, right? Like, the bandwidth for variability in a pitch is not very wide. Like a football player, a rugby player, they need a lot of variability in their training. Pitching, we just need enough to get us a wider swath in which we can operate. And I think that things like long toss and a lot of the variable throwing that we do is really helpful to kind of minimize the overuse problem while also adding load. And we just think variability instead of intensity is the way to go.
Yeah. Cool. I think that's a good way to think of it. You're kind of teaching the body healthy ways to self-organize, right? Find different solutions. The thing that interests me about pitching injury, right? You're getting injured doing something you've done 100, 200 times before. Like, it's not you don't get injured when you throw 110 mile an hour fastball when you normally throw 95. It's a pitch you've thrown a million times before. Why does it injure you now? Is it probably, like, I think it's because, well, if you don't train it, you're going to get compensations that are not. They're going to keep your performance, but they're not very healthy. By bringing in smaller muscle groups, bringing in to keep that velocity up, but not in a healthy way. Yeah. So I think that's what, I always laugh at that study. That was my first reaction. Of course, that's what we want. We want you to throw the same mechanics from 120 feet that you throw from 60. That's the whole
point. I thought the world was coming to an end with that study, Ken. I'm thinking to myself, oh man, all these years of promoting long toss, and but then fortunately people like Randy came to my rescue, and the first person that actually really, I guess what's the right way to say this, that I guess really made me feel good about the whole thing and hopeful was Stan Conte. He was the first person to talk to me in like 2012 or 13 about that the stress is a good part of it. And I love Glenn Fleisig. He's awesome. And, we're friends. And, but as I've told Randy before, I think if you're going to do he did a long toss study at Birmingham. And I feel like you almost really need to have at least one control group of expert long tossers. So here's one example. I've been pushing since 1990, almost 34 years. I've been pushing, which to me is so funny. It's like the most basic aspect of throwing, but crow hopping off the back leg when you throw as opposed to shuffling your feet. Now, it doesn't mean you can't shuffle your feet early on, or as Randy said, do variability movements. I'm all about being athletic and changing things up. But at some point, especially beyond 90, 120 feet or so, once you start getting out to 250, 300, and so on, is you want to crow hop off your back leg for several reasons. But the main thing is to support the arm and put the load on the lower half and to connect with ground forces. And so in the study Glenn did, and again, Glenn's awesome and he's doing his best, but I would want to have had a control group where they had expert long tossers that, number one, knew how to crow hop off the back leg. I can't say for a fact they didn't crow hop off the back leg versus shuffling, but I know from going to spring training for 30 years, and I know, or whatever, I just know from being around players my whole life that it is very unusual to see someone crow hop off their back leg unless they've been taught to do it. So chances are they shuffled. And so they put an unusual or an unnecessary amount of stress on the elbow, on the valgus torque, so to speak. And so I feel like in a way, it really wasn't giving us measurements that were really true to the spirit of the study. But it doesn't matter because as it turned out, as both of you had said, they just really proved some points that needed to be talked about anyway.
Yeah, I think this is a point. Like I keep trying to like the way the idea of representative design, which the long toss is a great example. I think we're not trying to get you to learn the movement pattern that you're going to use in a game and pull it out. We don't want you to throw like you're going to throw off the mound. Like we know that we're getting you to learn a new problem, throwing the ball really far. And the crow hopping, I think, is a great example. You're making the point of connecting to the ground and using those forces really loud, right? By doing this different way of throwing. Of course, you can't do that in a game. We know that unless you move to outfield or something. But as a pitcher, you can do that in the game. But that information you're getting and solving that new problem, throwing from 300 feet, is a valuable thing that you can bring to throwing from 60 feet. That's the whole premise of representative. So I think, that's a good example. Yeah.
Well, you can also add this too, Rob, that I got this from Andrew Checkett's probably 10, 12, 14 years ago, because I've had so many discussions with people on long toss, and I love getting into it because I've been doing it so long that it's like in my soul, but yet I love when I hear new things from people or I get little nuggets here and there. And Andrew said, you're the closest to who you are on a mound at 350 feet anyway. It's like the further out you go in a way, and I'm being a little facetious, but there's some truth to this, that, the further out you go, the more you have to get similar into who you are off the mound, because you have to get into that explosive mode. You have to get into your ground forces. You can't fail. You're at 350 feet. I'm using an extreme example, right? To hit your partner in the chest at 350 feet perfectly is you have to organize, obviously, incredibly well. You can't be late. You can't be early, right? You have to sync up mechanically. You have to really get into your ground forces well. There's no chance you're going to get it there. So there's another aspect to this. On the one hand, there's an amazing amount of variability that comes from going out, right, gradually up and then coming in gradually down. But we're also, not us, but I'm just saying there's also a misconception or a misunderstanding that, that long toss pulls you out of your mechanics, which, by the way, thank you, but like you're way off because you're out of your mechanics and your release point changes, which we all know here is a great thing. But I still think there's a misunderstanding that there are so many things that are emulating who you're going to be. These micro adjustments, these micro adaptabilities that happen in long toss that, of course, are happening in the game. And as Butch Thompson says, I can't sign my own name twice in a row, and we're worried about repeating mechanics. And so I feel like that's the part of long toss that fortunately has come around now. I think people are really more educated by it, but we could do a whole show on long toss alone and the benefits of it. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good example. I think it goes back to what Randy was saying at the start, right? The constraints on throwing a ball 98 miles an hour are very narrow. There's only so many things you can do. the same is true of throwing the ball on a line from 350 feet. There's only so many things that you can do that will make it go that to achieve that goal. So it is putting some of the same kind of pressures on, just different body parts, different organization. So that's what we want, right? That's a good example. Right. Randy, did you have a?
Yeah. Well, a similar study came out about weighted balls recently, and they became the next demon. Is that, you know, in this particular study, they used up to 2-pound balls with crow hops and running throws, and, you know, kneeling throws and things like that. And in the study, they showed that they got increased external rotation of the experimental group that they attributed to the weight of the ball. And it was a really rapid increase in external rotation. And then subsequently, 4 of them in the season got hurt. And then after this, in the study got hurt. And then after this study was over, the next season, several of them, a significant number of the players in the experimental group got hurt. And the implication was that the weighted balls caused the injury. Okay. And the connection was that the rapid increase in external rotation made it such that they couldn't control the movement, and that led to the injury. And so weighted balls became demonized. And again, you wrote about this in our book, that the weighted ball is neither good nor bad. It's just a tool. It's just an implement to provide a constraint. And when used properly, can be a very valuable tool, because if you stay within a certain bandwidth, again, we don't need to go to extreme weights with the weighted ball programs, because the bandwidth of variability in a pitch isn't very wide. So we can go a little above and a little below. And you indicated in our book that really important that you randomize the weights, that you kind of mix them all up so your body can't predict what the weight's going to be when you pick the ball up. I think that's a brilliant idea. But we don't need to go too far above and below. We don't need to go crazy with it, because indeed, I do know this. If you change hardware's how you're made, software's how you're moving. If you change hardware or software rapidly, then you lose the motor control self-organization dynamics. It becomes really difficult. Those changes need to happen gradually, okay? And many times when you're approaching like a velocity program, you learn to impart more energy into the tissue than it has had time to adapt to, okay? So it probably takes 6 weeks or so for that tissue to adapt to the stresses you're putting on it. When you first started bench pressing, Rob, I know you're a big bench presser, right?
Oh, yeah.
And the first time you did it, you're like, man, and within a week you could lift a lot more. You didn't get stronger. The muscle didn't hypertrophy. The muscle didn't change. You got more coordinated at the skill, right? Yeah. You got better at pushing energy through the bar. And it's sort of like that with throwing. You have to make sure that any hardware changes you have, the physiologic changes and the neurologic changes go hand in hand. If there's a gap, we have a zone of vulnerability, and now the tissue can't adapt to the energy we can impart upon it. And I think we put ourselves at risk. And so when guys are making rapid gains, you have to really watch those guys closely, right? And I think that weighted balls, although it has been demonized, again, it's a polarizing argument, and I don't think it's good or bad. I think if we use it appropriately under the right conditions with the right athlete, I think it's great. I don't think we need to start with weighted balls. I think we need to get the movement stable first. And then I think adding weighted balls and long toss creates a flexibility in the bandwidth of the movement that we begin to bang the edges and test and explore the edges so that we can protect ourselves when things don't go perfect.
Yeah. And this is the kind of point you're mentioning about. This is one of my favorite, blending strength and conditioning and skill training. Like, is there a better way to, if you're instead of going away doing a few weeks of bench press and traditional exercises, is there a way we can develop the hardware while we're keeping the software organized? Like, is there better? I'm sure there's better strength exercises we could do, or blending them in with other kind of things that are more skillful. Yeah.
With the help of Franz Bosch, of course, strength and coordination book that he wrote. Once that changed my life, we've been going down that path together for a while about designing new methodologies that integrate strength and coordination together, the skill and the strengthening developed. And that really requires a deep understanding of internal self-organization. Like, these things are emerging from the inside out, and we have to be careful because we have all this technology. We can measure all this cool stuff, right? But the magic is happening internally, right?
Yeah.
And we got to make sure that we don't fall prey to the problem they had in Vietnam, where since we can't measure what's important, we begin to make what we can measure seem way more important than it is. And so that's why we ended up with body counts in the Vietnam War, because we couldn't tell if we were winning. So we just started counting the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And it's just like this. So we have motion capture and wearable technologies, and we have force plate mounts, and we have all these external things that we can measure. But do you know, Rob, Alan knows this, no one really knows how much stress a UCL can take. No one really knows. And because of the problem that I call cadavers and robots, we determined how much stress the UCL could take through a cadaver study, where we said it tears at 35 Newton meters of torque. And then we use motion capture to determine that it can tolerate, on a single pitch, it has to accept 70 to 75 Newton meters of torque. Well, we got the bottom number from a person who wasn't alive, a cadaver.
Yeah.
The tissue react the same way. And then we got the top from a model, a mythical robotic that assumed that self-organization complies with the rules of Newtonian physics, that we're made of metal and we're held together by rivets. And if so, those numbers would be accurate. But no one knows how much torque is imparted on the elbow, because the muscles have this incredible way to contract and coordinate at exactly the right moment to mitigate the stress. And we can never measure that. We're not even close to measuring it. We can estimate it, but the truth is we're working off a fundamental assumption that we know what's happening. And it speaks to Turvey's paper about how when you start with a flawed assumption that you think is noise, by adding people to this population, you don't actually eliminate the noise, you amplify the error that you made as you get bigger and bigger. And I think we might be heading down that path that we think we know, but we don't really know. I think we need to just begin to condition the body in a reasonable, progressive way, integrating strength and coordination together, training, having a new paradigm of how we train and prepare to use a lot of variability in training. You know, that's why we introduced those aqua bags and everything, because it imparts variability on the tissue so that it has to contract differently. And again, bringing Alan back into it, this is why I love long toss as a tool. It's a really functional, no equipment required, cheap, financially, fiscally responsible way to impart variability that doesn't require a lot of engineering, right? So, I mean, it's pretty just natural. So
I think it's a good example of one of those things we figured out when we were a kid, like playing tag. Like we play a lot. We go, oh, you go down there, keep moving back, I'll throw. Right? We figure them out as a kid, and then we lose their fun, and that'll help me get better. But for some reason, adults, we squash that all. No, we got to do this drill. Yeah. So that's really the strength. I remember. I think it was on our last summit. I think I learned that you can basically hang a car from your IT band. Right? Our bartenders are pretty strong, right? They're meant to be. They're very strong naturally if we use them right. But it's the strongest thing in the heart and the human body. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why we need to connect with the ground, because if we don't, we can't use those. We're the only species that has an IT band, and if we don't connect with the ground, we don't use it. So
and that bugs you when you want to go running. Yeah.
Exactly.
No, I think that So you're kind of progressive. So progression, variability. So Alan, when we're doing long toss, do you have a certain kind of pattern that you do? Do you guys like progressively increase distance or vary distance? Is there a certain way that you kind of look at it?
Yeah, to put it in a nutshell and real quickly on the when you guys are talking about sort of variability and strength at the same time, or skill and strength. First thing I thought of two things. One is yoga, because I used to teach yoga, but bands. And again, this is there's many angles to come out when you're talking, of course, about development. But I just think if someone just knew of nothing else to do band work 4 or 5 days a week, especially in the downtime when they're not doing anything. Randy talks obviously a ton about keep the body moving, so to speak. But bands, for whatever reason, I'm about to play tennis here a little bit later on. The thought of picking up my tennis racket or throwing a baseball without doing my bands is comical. There is something, I use the word magical and mystical, those two words I don't know what it is about bands. I know there's a science behind it, but to me, there's something else. I can't explain it. So I just wanted to make a quick comment that I feel like, it's also, you talk about financially simple, when it comes to tools, you could do bands. I just think that's just something I want to make sure that people that are listening to this understand, that bands can take you so far, just from elasticity, range of motion, variability. And then there's the endurance, strength, and there's the small muscle attention that, as Randy talked about earlier, a lot of people get into that, the weight room per se. A great way to counterbalance going in the weight room or doing any kind of big muscle work is bands, right? To isolate the smaller muscles. As far as long toss, I'd say this in the simplest terms. If someone is starting from scratch, assuming they're maybe about the high school age and above, it's going to take about 4 to 5 weeks to do it our way, to progressively, there's the key word, progressively get into optimal throwing shape. And that's based on throwing at least 6 days a week. See, there's some caveats here, right? You can say to someone it takes 4 to 5 weeks to get in shape, and they're throwing 3 days a week, and that's not going to cut it. That would concern me, actually. So I would say, as a simple base to long toss, plan on getting into quote unquote long toss shape. It's going to take you 4 to 5 weeks. What that means is that you're going to get to your furthest distance, but it's not just your furthest distance. You've progressively gotten to your furthest distance, but you've also learned to build a lot of volume and endurance along the way. I have a saying that I love, which is build the volume and endurance first, and let the distance come organically, because it will. Like stretching out any muscle group, it's gonna open up and it's gonna happen. But focus more on the volume. Another thing that's huge to long toss is that as a part of the practice is a lot of people come out of the gate and they want to throw the ball more firmly and on a line. And our philosophy is the opposite. Randy's heard this a million times from me, but one of my favorite and to me most essential principles to understand about throwing is what's called massage throwing, right? Low intent, relaxation, right? You don't go out and sprint a 60 right away, right? You stretch, and then you might do you might walk, and then you might do some slow jogging, and then you might jog, and then you might do some slow running. Eventually we're going to get to the sprint. That might be an hour down the road, right? And long toss is the same. It takes time to slowly build into this. We want the arc from the beginning, quarterback throwing a screen pass. We want what we call massage throwing. It's almost like you want 2% effort on your first throw or 3% effort. We want to add a percent. So as you get to 60 feet, you might be at 7%. And when you're at 90 feet, you might be at 28%. And when you're at 120 feet, you might be at 58%. But the idea is it takes a while to get to, if you're a 300-foot athlete, and that's your 100%. Again, it's going to probably take about 4 weeks to get there. And then there's the second piece. And then, I'm trying to do 34 years in 3 minutes. The second piece is the pull down phase. So that's when you start taking the lower intent, high arc throwing, right? The massage throwing. And let's say you cap out eventually, probably 3 to 4 weeks into it is when you get to your max distance. Well, now there's a whole other art form. And this is the pull down phase. And you don't, even if you're at 300 feet and you're fully stretched out and you're conditioned well, you still don't want to start throwing with high intent on the way back in with full intent. You can maybe do 85%, or 90%, because you are fully stretched out. So the arm is ready for relative full exertion. But there's even sort of a progression to the pull down phase. So we're talking about 5 weeks to just get into the shape to where you're ready to start pulling down with, a reasonable amount of high intent. But I'd say in a perfect world, you're not really off a mound with your first bullpen throwing 80 to 90%, maybe until you're 6 weeks in. So just to sort of give people sort of a general idea about
your approach. Yeah. I like that. Yeah.
Which,
I think that's
really. I'm sorry. Which really speaks to the
Randy.
concept of periodization, like how this concept of periodization of training has taken hold from the strength and conditioning world, that you have to have these cyclical shutdowns and startups. He just told you that it's going to take you about 6 weeks to ramp up. That's a lot of times, that's the only time that people give themselves before they're in the season, is 6 weeks if they shut down for a long period. And so I think much of the literature on periodization has been, maybe refuted is not the best word, but at least challenged, about how this idea that we have to cycle our training. I think that a better plan is to stay close to ready, so that you're ready to dig into that 6 weeks, and it doesn't maybe take you as long, because you're already always almost there, and then you can bring it. And then the other part of long toss I love, on the pull down phase, we begin to mimic the repetitive design of the temporal constraints in a throw. Like, this doesn't have a time pressure. As we bring it down, now we begin to mimic the time pressure that you actually have when you get to the end point.
Yeah. I think there's an important point here too. I think I'm hearing from you. You guys, I wanted to bring this up. You guys just put out a book material on throwing rehab, into rehab from injury, which you can get from both your sites, I think.
Free.
Yeah. And I know from talking to you, Randy, one of the central ideas is that you've already talked, giving the tissue a stimulus to organize itself instead of just sitting around doing nothing. But I think going into what we're talking about today, you can think about it, you're always recovering from injury as a pitcher, not like micro injury. Yeah.
That's a really good point.
Right. You always got to give that stimulus, because you're always recovering. It's not a major surgery, but it's micro injury. And if you let that build, that's where you're going to get in trouble. If you don't, So I think that's really, I think that's what the point you're trying to make. Taking a full time off, I think also I think that goes back to Alan's point. There's other ways you can train that is still effective. We have to accept then full intent throwing off a mound, right? I think that's like with running. I think we're periodizing running, and you're using that as an example. Like hiking is a good thing to do as running training. If you accept that I don't have to be always running so many miles per hour, do hiking instead of taking completely a full time off. Yeah, that kind of idea. There's other things, lower intent, longer, that are still effective, but they don't feel like you're pitching. But we have to include those things. Yeah.
No, accept. But I would even say, Rob, we have to embrace. I mean, the things you can do. I would want to flip this to where people see this as like, even though it's not functional training, as you said, off a mound, that people have to understand. That's one of the best things about long toss, is that you're getting 17 incredible benefits at once, and part of that is you're diversifying, the training, but also you're getting into areas that are profoundly impactful on you as a pitcher. Your conditioning, your endurance, your feel, and the word I learned from Randy a long time ago, your proprioception, right? Your adaptability. And look, if we're talking about the beginning of the show, we talked about injuries or injury preventions. Well, to me, there's not a close to, and I know maybe I'll get in trouble for saying that, because there's so many great things out there that are important to the body. But throwing to me is king. You throw for a living. Throwing is still king. It's still the number one, whatever you want to call it, source, for how well you're going to, excel in your profession. And so, to me, long toss is about throwing, and it's about conditioning, and it's about endurance. And as you said, I love that. I've never heard that before. You're constantly recovering. Well, what's one of the best things that come out of long toss is you're building endurance so that you can have better recovery. So I wasn't like necessarily disagreeing with what you're saying, Rob. I just wanted to add to the point that we should be seeing these other tools, which is why I go back to this idea of getting on a mound and doing the measurables all the time, and the Rapsodo and the spin rate. And I know there's a time and a place for that, but man, I feel like we've gotten myopic with that. And that to me is sort of like the grain of sand. The beach is the throwing and the long toss and the conditioning and the training things that you do at, the Florida Baseball Armory. Like that to me is the beach. that grain of sand is getting on the mound and doing X, right, and working on your spin rate. But we've flipped that. We've gotten to where we're so hyper focused on these numbers. And to me, if you said what is possibly the single greatest contributor to the problems out there right now, it's a lack of awareness. Awareness is one of my favorite words. There's a lack of awareness of the importance of doing all the things Randy's talking about from a training development point of view and these core principles of long toss.
Yeah, I think it's linear thinking. If I get this guy to just work on getting more spin, it's only going to affect this, right? No, it's going to affect a bunch of things unpredictably that could hurt him if he's not ready to get for that, right? I think also, I like about this approach too. It's practical. Like, of course, throwing super high velocity is part of the issue, but that you can't stop that, right? That's part of baseball. That's part of, and look at it. Guys are trying to run sub 2 hour like that happens in every sport. We're pushing our limits constantly. Right? We have to prepare ourselves. We can't say you can't. That's being human, right? Trying to throw harder and harder is part of being human, and that's part of what you need to be if you want to make it in the major leagues. For most people, at least to get noticed, you gotta let the guys. But you have to be ready for it and accept, right? Yeah, I think that's a good.
Yeah, and also, that's a really good point, Rob. When esteemed journalists that published really good, popular articles said the problem is they're throwing too hard. The question becomes, so what's the solution? Stop throwing hard. Well, until they stop rewarding the throwing hard part, like when they start signing guys throwing 82, then maybe the paradigm will shift, but it's never going back. So we're not going to get guys to throw slower. We're not going to get them to stop throwing sweepers. They're going to keep trying. We got to teach them how to endure it. We got to teach them how to be able to survive it. And I think that a big piece is managing the delta. The number one contributor of injury, Dr. Marcus Elliott, the number one contributor to injury is the delta, the change. What changed that we didn't manage? So any change needs to be managed and gradually introduced. And you can't just insert a massive perturbation and then expect everything to organize properly. I think of the birds, the mermaiding of the birds, and then something jumps into the flock and they all spread. That's sort of shocking the system, right? You have to influence it gradually, incrementally. You can't, like if you're trying to learn a new pitch, you got to learn it slow. If you're going to do weighted balls, you got to introduce them gradually. You got to, and that requires time, and people sometimes don't allow themselves time to do it. So.
Yeah, I think I think like I keep saying that any constraint you change is gonna have an unpredictable interaction. So we gotta, and then like the pitch clock, right? We could practice guys having only a certain amount of times between, and let them build up to it. Give a longer pitch clock. Like, don't just suddenly throw them in because you assume it's just gonna have this kind of one straight line effect, right? You don't know what the effect is gonna be on their delivery. You just got to throw it at them and let them self-organize. And figure out a way in progressive ways. Yeah, I think that's a
without any education in ecological dynamics or self-organization or motor control. Alan Jaeger, in his brilliance, came up with a term that he shared with me: self-regulation, and his thought process mirrors ecological dynamics really well. It's just letting the body organize itself and regulate itself. He calls it listening to your arm, listening to your body, but also trusting. You can guide it. You can use constraints and guide it, but you have to let it explore within a bandwidth. And that speaks to the idea too, Rob. You've been in spring training. Every bullpen is measured. TrackMan, Rapsodo, Force Play. Every bullpen is measured. We have data on every single bullpen. When we have data on every single bullpen, every single experience that's supposed to be a training experience, spring training, turns into a tryout, not a workout. It's a tryout. For it to not have good numbers because it's going to go up to the front office. So when I'm experimenting with something, I have to be good. I have to make it better. and I can't afford to have a subpar bullpen. There are no good or bad bullpens. There are only learning experiences, right? And so we get guys in this mode where I'm competing at peak level because I know the people upstairs are going to judge me because they're going to get this report. And the overuse of mental feedback, right?
That's motor learning 101, right? Performance is separate than learning. Like often you got to not perform well to learn and grow. So, and the other thing I think, your point about that, anything that we can measure is not going to be, by the time you see something in that, it's too late to detect an potential injury. Like a drop in velocity, that's way late. Right? Then they're probably the elbow UCL is already snapped in half by the time that's happened. Yeah. But are there other things, like I know I'm if I remember right, and you maybe you guys talk about this in your manual, like your keep it, don't let it hurt and don't make it weird. Is that your rehab philosophy? Are there things we can, like when we're recovering, or that we can monitor instead of the numbers, instead of the other things, that we can kind of track this? I probably not easily, but what is there things that you look for, like I guess in rehab it's a different story, but yeah.
Well,
sorry,
why don't you speak,
yeah.
why don't you speak to Ben Brewster's, like the how we use the radar gun to kind of measure intent and whatever.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to let you I'll comment on this, Rob, and then Randy can talk about the objective feedback from Ben Brewster. I'm going to go back to my sweet spot, which is, your question leading up to it, which was back to self-regulation, which I think I stole from you, Randy. But the standardized protocols that are out there and have been out there for 50 years, right? We're at the 50-year mark. 1974 was the first TJ by Dr. Jobe, right? Mm-hmm. So understandably so, you can say the origins of the original rehabs, right? They had to do some trial and error and bring some people in a room and come up with some ideas, probably based on what they did for post-knee surgery, right? And so they gauged some ideas. I don't think the ideas were the end all. They were just to sort of do the rehab part. So what I love about our manual is what we did way differently is we stayed in the same lane, let's say for the first 10 weeks of, the real simple buildup, right? The real, really making sure that the elbow and the tissue, everything is in good shape. But this is where we get to the self-regulation. In other words, we are trying to get away from the structure, right? Like that's what everybody wants, is they want to know exactly how many numbers, how many throws at this foot increment on this day. And we're good with that. That's why we have 28 weeks of very clear and concise guidelines that of course have adaptability built in and individuality built in. But we say this 50 different times throughout the manual. When you go out and throw today, yes, we're saying you're probably about here based on a lot of experience, but listen to your arm. Maybe you make 40 extra throws today or 20 less throws today, but because of that tomorrow, which was a day off, you now want to throw again on that day off. So in other words, we're trying to get the athlete to truly get into the higher intelligence of the body. And maybe at first it's a little bit of a scary proposition because they want to be, understandably so, guided every throw. But this goes back to our baseline philosophy, which is the higher intelligence of the body is what's going to get you to your most optimal state. And if that's the case, our job is to get you to be that in tune with your body. And so I just wanted to comment first on back to the individuality, adaptability piece of really being in tune with your body and letting yourself self-regulate. And with that, I'll kick it to Randy for more of the objective feedback part of the manual.
Ben Brewster really made a nice contribution to this. He gave us a graph of what is 20% intensity. If you could throw 90 miles an hour before surgery, how hard is actually 20, 30, 40%? And a grid that we can use like a radar gun to kind of measure that and get instead of just perceived exertion, it's actual, this is how hard you threw. But that said, that's helpful, right? But the question is, what measurables can we have? One of the problems with the initial traditional return to throwing protocol is the only criteria for advancement was time. At this week you do this, at this week you do this, at this week you do this. And in the manual, we've written in now the ability to modulate and self-organize. Here's the guidelines. You kind of want to be in this window, but Wes McGuire taught me this. He made this up back in the day, but it's one of complex systems organized around simple rules.
Mm-hmm.
And in pitching, the rules are don't make it look weird and don't let it hurt. Pain is the number one constraint, right? If it hurts, I made a career in physical therapy and baseball of what I call rubber chicken therapy, meaning, if it hurts when I do this, then I'm gonna hit you over the head with a rubber chicken and say, don't do that again. If it doesn't hurt, then do more of that, right? It's from the old hee-haw days, right? So don't make it look weird, don't let it hurt. Are there measurables? I'm not sure we can measure the internal dynamic. We can see evidence, but I think we're probably decades away from having true measurables that tell the actual whole story. I think we gotta become the architects of the environment and then watch for the simple rules and then trust the body's ability to self-organize and influence.
Yeah, and if I read you right, I think why you say that part is like pain avoidance is a very dangerous constraint for athlete to be under. We're good, like in Gibson's terms, that's a negative affordance, right? It's affordance for something we're avoiding. Like I relate this to running. I trail back into trail running. Like my knee hurts, I'm okay with running as long as it doesn't. If I notice that it's changing my stride in some way, that's when it gets really. Then I'll have a hip injury on the other side in 2 days if I keep pushing through that. Right? That's when it gets pain. Avoiding pain is not a good constraint to self-organize around. Right? If you can avoid it, it's a very powerful thing. It'll make your body can do it, but it's going to resort to little smaller muscles, a whole bunch of dangerous things. So I think that's why you're like, don't make it hurt, don't make it weird, right? Trying to if you get to that point, maybe we should do this longer, not just this part of the rehab, not just because we reached to so many days or weeks, right? We should feel it.
Pain isn't good or bad. It's information. If it hurts at this level, okay, let's back up and let your body reorganize. You don't have to. It's not catastrophic. It's not panic. It's like, okay, let's try a different way, or something like that. So,
no, that's interesting. Yeah, no, I think that's a good. So, I think so that's kind of and you're talking about what we've done after we've injured, which I think there's a lot of similarities. Before we want to do the same kind of things. Progressive build-up, variability, all those same kind of things. I think that's the message we're pitching today. The main message, we have to strengthen, get the body, the arm used to the stresses it's going to face in the game, in practice. I think we have to do that. That's the bottom line. Not avoid them like, treating the phrase everyone uses, you only have so many bullets in your gun. Like you only have so many pitches in you, so we don't want to waste them. That's that's avoidance. That's a very dangerous proposition. The idea, So I think that's a good way to think about it. Yeah. I think when we're talking about young players or anything message you would send differently to young athletes, like young pitchers, or the same kind of same ideas we're talking about here. Alan, do you?
I have my simple rule of thumb is condition more. I'm not necessarily talking about hitters, they can play a lot more, but for pitchers, condition and train more and don't worry about pitching so much in games. I mean, you have to pitch, you have to get better. It's fun to play in games. So definitely do it, but the focus should be on conditioning, and if they're really young kids, of course, I would obviously recommend playing other sports for diversification reasons, and athleticism reasons. But no, I think the main thing is just condition more, avoid shock in the arm. That's like, Randy has his go-to bullet points. Mine is that, and I will say one other thing about the bullets and the gun analogy. You make throws, you don't use them up, and until our world starts to figure that out, we're very vulnerable as a baseball community until we figure out that you condition and make throws as opposed to use them up. That to me, I've never understood. That concept to me alone could set us back 50 years. And but yeah, the youth one, I'm sure Randy's done a lot in that world, so I'll let Randy talk more about that.
Yeah. So okay, when in conditioning a youth athlete, it is a little different because you have to scale it for age and skill level, and they don't have the motor control that older players have, and so I think that one of the problems I see in rehab is when everybody gets hurt, our first inclination is rest. Stop throwing. Yeah. Right. And we get into this, and they call everything tendonitis, and I call it the itis cycle. Like, look, I've never just spontaneously itis. I wasn't sitting around there in my shoulder. Oh, my shoulder itis. Something made it. Something made it itis. Right. We got to figure out what's contributing to the itis, and instead of just resting and then coming back and doing the exact same thing and expecting that the rest is going to make it go away, I think we have to reorganize the tissue. We have to get it to self-organize differently. So rest isn't always the best medicine there. I think there's a short period when a person's injured where it's reasonable to rest. But the one caveat I would say with a youth player, in my experience, has been this finicky growth plate, the growth plate issue, okay? These vulnerable bone factories in youth that we don't have in adults. And it has been incredibly unpredictable. Like, I can't figure out what kind of profile makes it happen. Like, it just didn't see it coming. Didn't expect that kid, would have thought that kid would have had one and he didn't. It's just super unpredictable. And because you can't really reorganize the growth plate, and if you irritate it, you may cause it to malfunction completely and have long-term effects down the road. I think that is the number one time where absolutely this kid's 12 years old, 10 years old. We got to play the long game. We got to be ready for when 22. And so it's not going to kill us to take a little time away from throwing here and let that recover. I don't think we have to panic and say you shouldn't throw for a year. I think you should back it off, let things settle down, work around it. The phrase that I actually learned this from Ron Woolforth: never let what you can't do keep you from doing what you can. So work around it while you rest, and then gradually reintroduce throwing, but listen to the body and listen to the arm. Now, that's harder because the youth guys, they can't really communicate with you very well what they feel. They're not in tune with their bodies as much. But of course, you scale it for, like on long toss, the distance is obviously different because they can't throw it as far. I don't think we need to introduce a weighted ball program to a 10-year-old. I think that we can use athleticism and variable throws. We can just have them do throws as a shortstop and as a center fielder and become an elite thrower before he becomes an elite pitcher. I think that's a big problem too. Like, pitching should just be throwing from the hill. It shouldn't be, the movement shouldn't be a lot different, right? And so I think we can scale it and manage it. I think you have to manage the volume and the workload because of those finicky growth plates. But again, people asked me the other night on a podcast, is there a different kind of conditioning program for a position player versus a pitcher? I think there has to be a different kind of conditioning program for this position player versus, Johnny and Joey and Jimmy. They all have to have their own. And you have to really be able to individualize that. And so for youth, it's absolutely the risk reward thing, right? Everybody knows, everybody knows the only safe pitch count is 0. Okay. Right. And there's this risk. I think the further down your career you get and the more sense of urgency you have, like, if I don't do something, it's going to be over. I think that equation shifts. And I think early you have to err on the side of averting the risk more so than you do for an older person. Yeah.
No, I think the growth plate, I'm dealing with this with my stepson. He has Sever's disease, is growth plate, growth plate from Severs. Playing football. it's finicky thing. Yeah. But I like your tendonitis. If you describe it, okay, I did this, or I did too much. Now I'm hurt. Now I'll do nothing at all. Then I'll go back to doing that same thing the exact same way again, and it's not magically. It's not gonna hurt somehow. Oh no, I got it again. Yeah, it's when you describe it like that, it's completely illogical. But maybe we need to do something different. But that doesn't really enter into it, right? That it just magically, it's suddenly going to cause injury. But yeah, no. So I hope. To kind of wrap things up, I think I don't know if there's the whole point of this is there's no one answer, right? That's part of the point of this. There's no one thing that you can do to prevent injury or that causes injury. That's why it's such a difficult problem. Like we didn't even get into mechanics. The people on Twitter are always they watch one throw by a guy, always gonna have Tommy John, and okay. We don't. That's your outside problem again. We don't know that. But I think the idea of conditioning and strengthening and giving time to be able to, and the idea of not running away from the load and the forces that they're gonna have to, or getting ready for it, I think is a very valuable one. I think that's very valuable. Yeah, valuable message, and doing it in different ways. Getting we didn't even get into synergies in your body, making slight adjustments to do the same thing. And I think you're right, Randy. Because it's a self-paced skill, there's not going to be a huge variation in how you pitch, but there still is, and you're not going to be able to see it, obviously, very super easily, but it's still going on there. So thanks, guys. Thanks for joining me. Really appreciate it. Hopefully, I know this is as I said, we could do the same one every year. We'll just set it on here, listen to this every year because it's a recurring. Yeah, I agree with you, Randy. I don't know that it's any worse this year than everyone says the sky's falling every time it happens, but it happens all the time. I don't know if it's any worse. If someone's done statistical things to show it's worse, it just kind of someone famous does it, or then it gets more news. But
it may not have got. I'm sorry, Rob. The funny thing is that people think it's gotten worse, but the point is that it's a reminder. If it happens in March and April, it's just a reminder that the problem is not being addressed as well as it could be. And so, we worry about the sky falling, but look, if we need to get kicked in the side of the head to get reminded again that, hey, this is not resolved. And so I know it's something that Randy and I both believe strongly in, that there are just a lot of things you can do to help resolve the problem. And everybody knows it's multifaceted. But I will say this, that it is a reminder that there is still, not a minor, a major problem with how we're addressing this. And this is a wake-up call. And unfortunately, for the last several Aprils, we keep getting these wake-up calls, and these wake-up calls have been coming for 20 years. And it's time to make some adjustments. And the adjustments we're talking about are very organic, and they have to do more with, to me, getting back to nature. And I will leave on this note. Nature always wins. If you try to go toe-to-toe with a hurricane or a tidal wave, you've got no chance. We need to let nature support us and help us. That's the higher intelligence of the body. And we need to get back to things like instincts and self-regulating. And of course, the focus for today is get back to conditioning and not shocking the body, which all these high intent throws all the time are doing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for joining me. That was a lot of fun. I'm going to end this now. Let me sign off here. And thanks, everyone, for watching and following along.
Thank you, Rob, for having us.